Representative Omar entered the Capitol prepared to dismantle Ben Shapiro on national broadcasts, yet she committed the grave error of yielding the floor to the single individual armed with precise audio evidence demonstrating that her statements placed a bullseye directly on the living quarters of an 18-year-old female student. The Congresswoman held her index finger high while her smartphone buzzed against the wooden paneling next to her beverage, as the conservative commentator positioned 3 tiers beneath her in a dark blue blazer without a cravat and a dark kippah secured to his hair, deliberately decelerated his rapid-fire delivery of the past hour and a half to the solemn pace of someone unloading a heavy burden held since the fall of 2023, stating that while she did not cast the stones herself, she certainly marked the destinations. The entire chamber went completely still. The mobile device resting on the elevated desk buzzed once more, prompting the representative to extend her arm before halting her movement mid-air. When the cellular device shook for a third instance, she actively chose to leave it resting there. Positioned in the gallery's third tier, occupying the fourth chair, a 39-year-old medical doctor named More Toledano Shapiro remained perfectly motionless, having clasped her marital ring within her left fingers throughout the entire morning session. Occupying the seventh spot in the fourth tier was a 51-year-old spiritual leader named David Edelman from a St. Louis Park, Minnesota congregation, who kept a creased document tucked inside his jacket because he simply possessed no requirement to read it. Should you have ever deeply anticipated witnessing a sitting federal lawmaker being confronted directly on broadcast television and demanded to justify how their rhetoric materialized onto the exterior of a Jewish house of worship following a historic tragedy, enthusiastically press the approval icon immediately, since this exact scenario unfolded openly within the halls of Congress, catching absolutely everyone off guard when the witness activated his media file. The initial arrangement dictating that this confrontation would occur inside the primary legislative chamber of the Education and Workforce panel within the Rayburn complex was completely unexpected. Scheduled by a Republican leader from Michigan for 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning in early spring of 2026, the official docket outlined an investigation into collegiate prejudice, civil rights compliance, and the outward behavior of elected officials. Lawmakers organized a trio of specialized testifiers, where the initial pair of academic officials offered standard rehearsed remarks, while the final participant was a 42-year-old conservative lawyer and media executive from Tennessee, carrying prestigious legal credentials and numerous published literary works under his belt. The catalyst for convening this specific assembly on this particular day stemmed from a trio of sequential occurrences taking place between late 2023 and late 2025 that the oversight panel simply could no longer overlook. The initial timeline marker represented the dawn of a major Middle Eastern conflict, which subsequently triggered an overwhelming surge of nearly 3,000 confirmed prejudiced episodes throughout educational institutions nationwide. The subsequent chronological anchor was the afternoon the Minnesotan lawmaker paused on a metropolitan pavement bordering a prestigious university, directly sorting teenage Jewish citizens into two distinct ideological factions regarding mass casualties while being recorded by mobile devices. The final precipitating factor involved a morning when a prominent young conservative organizer suffered a fatal attack at a Utah college, prompting the Congresswoman to share digital content characterizing the deceased as a dangerous agitator whose tragic demise was inevitable. Half a year subsequently, during the spring of 2026, the presiding chairman officially initiated the committee proceedings. The embattled representative maintained her elevated position solely because an earlier legislative measure designed to revoke her panel privileges was narrowly defeated in the broader chamber by a single ballot after a quartet of conservative members surprisingly offered their protective support. She successfully retained her influential placement within the educational oversight body. Exactly 6 months following that narrow victory, she fully intended to exercise that authority. Striding into the designated hearing chamber shortly before 10 o'clock, she was adorned in a dark blue-green tailored outfit paired with a pale silk head covering and a cherished familial golden brooch, purposefully resting her smartphone upside down upon the tabletop. This action represented the customary decorum expected from an official who had proudly served on this specific panel for over 5 years. She deliberately refrained from glancing at the device's screen. The mobile equipment, adjusted to a noiseless mode, was programmed to physically alert her precisely 1 minute past the hour. The distinguished chairman struck the gavel to officially commence the gathering at 14 minutes past 10. At that very moment, she enacted the critical error that systematically unraveled her political standing. As the preliminary remarks began, the presiding officer maintained a remarkably balanced and steady vocal tone. Having served as a Protestant clergyman for over a decade prior to his political career, he completely refused to alter his authentic demeanor for the television broadcasters. The leader formally announced that the legislative body was active and officially granted the testifying media executive a 5-minute window to deliver his introductory declarations. The summoned expert rose to his feet clad in a deep blue tailored jacket lacking a formal collar strap, sporting a traditional head covering fastened with a tiny clip gifted by his spouse during his Ivy League commencement, before laying his personal mobile device face down and linking it directly to the chamber's broadcast network through a slender cord arranged by an assistant hours earlier. Instead of remaining upright at the podium, he took a seat, embodying the traditional posture of an individual providing formal testimony. He communicated utilizing the exact same rapid, information-heavy, and authoritative tempo that characterized his decade-long audio broadcasts, pausing only to articulate his initial thought deliberately enough so the national media equipment could capture every individual vocalization. Addressing the leader with an ancient scriptural quote about acting righteously without judging another person's inner intentions, he explicitly clarified that his purpose that day was purely to examine documented historical facts rather than to evaluate anyone's personal morality. He immediately accelerated his speaking velocity. His news organization had recorded nearly 3,000 corroborated occurrences of anti-Jewish hostilities across domestic universities following the early October tragedies, rapidly listing off staggering statistics from elite Northeastern schools all the way to a major Midwestern campus situated directly within the female legislator's own electoral territory. Following a brief silence, he noted that situated directly to his rear in the gallery was a spiritual leader from a specific Minnesotan congregation. This particular religious community serves approximately 850 active households. Scarcely 2 days after the overseas assault, vandals shattered half a dozen decorative glass panes at this facility using masonry blocks, defaced the pavement with a controversial liberation slogan, and affixed a paper to the primary entrance featuring one specific excerpt. That particular sentence was lifted directly from a social media declaration published several years earlier by the very congresswoman currently seated on the panel. He deliberately chose not to vocalize the exact contents of that message. Relinquishing his remaining allotted minutes to the presiding officer, he posed a solitary inquiry regarding whether landmark civil liberties legislation, enacted mere footsteps from their current location to shield citizens from federally funded discrimination, somehow harbored a hidden loophole excluding students of Jewish heritage from its crucial safeguards. He pressed his palms firmly against the surface of the testifying desk. There were still 43 seconds left on his official countdown clock. The committee had subsequently called upon a pair of legislators, starting with a conservative former professional football champion from Utah, who questioned the media executive concerning a prior Californian collegiate address that famously required massive municipal expenditures for law enforcement protection. A veteran liberal lawmaker hailing from Virginia then inquired about the bureaucratic processes related to civil rights implementation within the federal educational bureaucracy. Subsequently, the presiding officer uttered the pivotal phrase that ignited the entire confrontation, officially granting the Minnesotan representative her standard 5-minute questioning period, launching her defensive maneuver from a seated posture utilizing her stationed audio equipment. She addressed the conservative witness by sarcastically claiming a dwindling supply of respect before openly denouncing the entire gathering as a farcical spectacle. She grasped a traditional wooden writing utensil without actually applying graphite to paper, merely clutching it in her fingers. Highlighting her established status as a multi-term federal legislator serving on that very oversight group, she recounted her arrival in the nation as an adolescent fleeing a specific displacement sanctuary located in East Africa. She detailed how her maternal parent perished from a mosquito-borne illness during her toddler years, leaving her paternal parent, a former educator displaced by regional violence, to raise her in a tiny Midwestern dwelling sustained solely by meager hospitality industry wages. Pointing out the statistical improbability of her reaching such political heights, she elevated her digit to chastise the committee for platforming a figure whose digital social updates were demonstrably reviewed dozens of times by an extremist who perpetrated a horrific mass casualty event against worshippers at a Canadian religious center several years prior. She emphasized that this digital connection was grounded in verified judicial archives from the Canadian legal system rather than mere subjective conjecture. She accused him of publishing a controversial editorial in an international Middle Eastern periodical over a decade ago, where he essentially invalidated the religious authenticity of countless domestic citizens simply due to their liberal voting patterns. She forcefully declared that his true expertise lay in maximizing revenue for his digital audio programs rather than functioning as the ultimate judge of someone's ethnic or religious legitimacy. Noting that his spouse, seated close behind him, held citizenship in a Middle Eastern nation as boasted in his autobiography, she controversially likened the domestic citizenry's fiscal obligations toward that foreign government to a traditional marital dynamic. She lamented that domestic citizens are forbidden from scrutinizing this dynamic without facing severe prejudice allegations, highlighting the hypocrisy where her inquiries earn her hateful labels while his evasions earn him nationalist praise. She bluntly categorized the former president as an authoritarian leader, suggesting the populace elevated him to power out of a mixture of exhaustion and terror. While offering superficial condolences for the slain conservative organizer, she condemned the ideological coalition he constructed for consistently reducing intricate societal challenges into rudimentary scapegoating of marginalized demographics. Having already conveyed her condolences during the previous autumn, she steadfastly refused to utilize her official committee time to falsely sanitize the divisive nature of his political legacy. Pivoting to directly confront the spiritual leader in the gallery, she dismissed his ability to represent her state's broader Jewish constituency, asserting that electoral data prove she maintained overwhelming majority support from that specific demographic during her recent re-election bid. Boasting that over 4/5 of the relevant voting bloc in her primary county enthusiastically selected her name at the ballot box, she insisted that empirical statistics simply cannot deceive the public. Following a sustained silence, she returned her unused seconds to the presiding officer while explicitly holding back a secondary block of time to deploy once the media executive provided his rebuttal. Resting her wooden writing tool horizontally against the elevated desk, she consciously avoided glancing at her mobile device. The cellular equipment had not yet initiated its physical notification sequence. Shifting focus to the critical sound files, the committee had locked eyes with the conservative speaker and officially granted him a standard 5-minute block. The media founder retrieved his personal smartphone from the testifying surface, keeping the digital display visibly exposed without actively bypassing the security lock. Addressing the female lawmaker with stated genuine reverence, he expressed a distinct desire to accept portions of her critique without launching into an immediate defensive battle. Resuming his extraordinarily rapid delivery style, he freely admitted to authoring the controversial purity remarks during his late 20s, conceding his error and heavily referencing a decade and a half of subsequent published retractions proving his evolved stance. He vigorously condemned the Canadian Religious Center massacre as an unspeakable tragedy orchestrated by a remorseless fiend, while firmly arguing that the perpetrator's consumption of his digital updates did not equate to his own finger-pulling the weapon's firing mechanism. Nevertheless, he refused to argue against the documented judicial evidence regarding his digital footprint's presence in the killer's history, confessing to the representative that he had wrestled with the moral weight of those legal transcripts for nearly a decade. Halting his momentum to tread cautiously, he addressed her direct allegation that he monetized the marginalization of Islamic females by formally requesting the leader's authorization to introduce a recorded sound file directly into the official parliamentary proceedings. Pivoting toward the presiding officer, he politely requested permission to proceed. The committee had swiftly approved the procedural request. The witness gently pressed his mobile display, allowing the chamber's integrated multimedia equipment to broadcast the digital recording perfectly throughout the massive legislative room. The resulting audio consisted of the Congresswoman herself narrating a controversial internet posting from her previous election cycle, permanently saved on the digital platform, stating that everything revolved around currency notes in a brief 11-second clip. As the playback concluded, the media executive pierced the quietness by informing the lawmaker that the voice echoing in the room belonged entirely to her from a specific winter date years ago. He meticulously explained that the slang terminology explicitly denoted high-denomination Federal Reserve notes bearing the face of a prominent founding father, representing a ubiquitous cultural idiom for immense financial wealth. He asserted that within the framework of her digital message, the statement directly weaponized an ancient, 2 millennia-old prejudice linking Jewish advocacy organizations directly to illicit financial manipulation. Noting that even classical imperial scholars had documented variations of this exact bigotry during antiquity, he paused before reminding her that the broader legislative body formally advanced a specific censure measure the following month. That official reprimand, overwhelmingly supported by her own political allies, was drafted exclusively as a direct reaction to her personal social media activity rather than the inflammatory remarks of controversial conservative members. Activating his device's display once more, he asked the presiding officer for clearance to broadcast an additional recording, which the chairman immediately authorized. The subsequent broadcast featured the representative speaking during a major advocacy organization's yearly gala hosted at a prominent Californian hotel, originally documented for historical preservation by the National Broadcasting Network. The 18-second snippet featured her claiming the civil rights group expanded its mission after the September 11th tragedies simply because unidentified individuals committed vague actions, resulting in a widespread erosion of domestic freedoms. Cutting through the impending quiet, the witness furiously highlighted her dismissive six-word characterization of an event that violently eliminated nearly 3,000 innocent domestic citizens. He meticulously categorized the fallen, listing multiple Islamic victims, dozens of minors, hundreds of heroic municipal first responders, numerous military employees, and the brave travelers who purposefully brought down their hijacked airliner in a rural field, specifically to prevent the very legislative complex they currently occupied from becoming the final impact site that fateful morning. Taking a breath to significantly reduce his tempo, he reassured the lawmaker that he harbored no intention of attacking her immigrant background, given that he himself descended from individuals fleeing a specific Central European municipality. Disclosing that his great-grandmother perished in an infamous extermination camp alongside numerous relatives during the Second World War, he declared that they both possessed a shared legacy of displacement that he would zealously protect until his dying day. Halting briefly, he emphasized that possessing such a survivor's legacy demands a strict obligation toward absolute linguistic accuracy. He argued forcefully that minimizing mass terrorism with vague language does not reflect the voice of the displaced, but rather the rhetoric of unaccountability, highlighting a massive ethical chasm separating the two concepts. Placing his cellular device upon the table, he returned the floor to the presiding officer while retaining nearly 50 seconds of his allotted questioning period. The mobile equipment resting near the Minnesotan representative buzzed persistently, yet she completely ignored its physical alerts. Pause and absorb the reality that the Congresswoman, who spent over half a decade verbally flagellating conservative colleagues from the legislative floor, was just forced to endure her own dismissive commentary regarding thousands of terror victims broadcast directly into the permanent federal archives via a private citizen's mobile device. Assuming this revelation struck you with the same intensity it struck me, navigate to the discussion section beneath and submit a reply containing that exact dismissive phrase. Spell out those specific agonizing words utilized by an active member of the Educational Oversight Panel to describe the slaughter of thousands, drop your contribution, and immediately return to the broadcast. The upcoming multimedia evidence prepared by the conservative executive promises to render the initial confrontation incredibly mild, specifically regarding a massive electoral funding scandal, prompting the lawmaker's voice to erupt through her audio equipment demanding her minutes back. The presiding officer flatly denied her request, citing a highly specific parliamentary regulation visibly open before him that unequivocally grants the leader full authority to allow a testifying individual to thoroughly conclude their evidentiary response. Confirming that the media founder had surrendered his remaining seconds, the chairman officially permitted the representative to proceed with her secondary inquiries, causing her writing tool to subtly slide across the wooden surface. She aggressively pivoted to interrogate him regarding the fiscal foundations of his digital empire, questioning how an outlet publicly underwritten by incredibly wealthy Texan petroleum magnates could possibly assert any ethical high ground before being abruptly cut off. Unable to complete her thought, she was met with a barrage of fiscal transparency data as the witness systematically listed his corporation's regulatory submissions, private investment disclosures, state registries, and political action committee filings, emphasizing that every single document is externally evaluated by a premier accounting firm. Maintaining his relentless verbal velocity, he deliberately stressed that absolutely zero capital from his ventures flows directly into the pockets of his personal relatives acting as electoral contractors. However, exploiting her sudden interest in electoral funding ethics, he gripped his smartphone once more to pivot the scrutiny directly onto her own historical ledgers by reading aloud rather than broadcasting a recording. Citing specific publicly accessible federal regulatory identification numbers, he revealed that her official re-election organization funneled nearly $3 million into a specific limited liability consulting firm during the height of the previous presidential cycle, detailing that this particular corporate entity operated as an influential strategic group within the nation's capital. He calmly noted, following a brief silence, that the firm's primary executive ultimately became her legally wedded spouse by the spring of that same year. He recounted how nearly a year prior to those nuptials, the consultant's previous spouse submitted legally binding separation documents to the municipal justice system, officially claiming her then-husband confessed an unexpected and overwhelming romantic attachment to the Congresswoman. Drawing a sharp inhalation, he pointed out that during that exact same period, her political organization initiated travel compensation payments to the consultant's agency, eventually totaling tens of thousands of dollars according to undeniable government archives. He emphasized that once the scandal breached the mainstream news cycle in late autumn, she severed ties with the firm, but only after she had already redirected exactly 50% of her total grassroots donations from blue-collar Midwestern constituents directly into an agency partially owned by her romantic partner. Following a brief pause, he referenced a major financial newspaper's recent investigation highlighting that her personal economic disclosures had originally appraised her husband's coastal vineyard and corporate investment portfolio at a maximum of $30 million. He then outlined how she hastily submitted revised paperwork, drastically reducing their combined marital net worth down to a maximum of under $100,000, subsequently ordering her administrative staff to publicly deflect all responsibility onto a mathematical blunder committed by her bookkeeper. Placing his device down once again, he recalled a recorded confrontation where she aggressively insulted a conservative network journalist's intelligence simply for daring to question the massive accounting inconsistency. After waiting a moment, he reminded her of his Ivy League legal pedigree, suggesting that any practicing attorney who verbally abused an investigator over a multi-million-dollar federal paperwork anomaly would face an immediate disciplinary tribunal. He ominously warned her that while the national electoral regulatory attorneys operate on a timescale of years rather than weeks, their investigative machinery eventually catches up to every violator. Concluding his statement and returning the floor to the leader, he watched as the representative ignored two distinct physical buzzes from her communication device before rising from her chair. Elevating herself through pure defensive pride and a flawless multi-year television debating record against conservatives, she pointed her digit toward the media executive and proudly announced her historic status as the inaugural East African immigrant to infiltrate the federal legislature. She reiterated her arrival in the mid-90s alongside her male relatives following extensive hardships in a border sanctuary, having previously lost her mother to illness amidst the violent chaos of a notorious urban warlord's reign. Detailing her severe childhood poverty, she explained that her sole remaining guardian navigated their new Midwestern life without basic indoor plumbing or functioning communication lines for several years. Openly confessing to various rhetorical blunders throughout her tenure, she clarified that while she offered contrition for specific phrases, she firmly refused to seek forgiveness for the remainder of her statements. Emphasizing that sociological data dictated her inevitable failure rather than her current prestigious placement, she demanded to know if the vocabulary choices of a newly elected immigrant should truly serve as the ultimate standard of evaluation within a nation forged entirely by displaced laborers. Maintaining complete vocal composure after a momentary break, she directly answered his unspoken inquiry by admitting her previous financial slang usage was entirely inappropriate and demonstrably incorrect. She vigorously reminded him that when the broader legislative body officially processed the disciplinary measure regarding her behavior, she willingly cast a ballot against herself, pleading with him to acknowledge her personal accountability alongside her rhetorical errors. A profound quiet enveloped the room for nearly a decade of seconds as the presiding officer withheld his wooden mallet, allowing her effective counterpunch to fully register without any disruption from the conservative witness. Eventually breaking the stillness at a significantly reduced tempo, he affirmed that her harrowing background narrative of international displacement, parental tragedy, and domestic poverty possessed genuine intrinsic value. He acknowledged that her willingness to officially reprimand her own conduct held significant merit, but shifted the chronological focus completely away from the 90s or her freshman term directly onto a specific spring afternoon in late 2024. Retrieving his mobile device, he respectfully requested authorization from the committee head to broadcast a concluding multimedia file, a plea that was instantly validated. The subsequent sound emitting from the hall's amplifiers featured the lawmaker interacting with journalists upon the pavement bordering an elite academic institution during a sunny afternoon almost 2 years prior. The recording captured her demanding general safety for students of Jewish heritage while incredibly dividing those exact same teenagers into categories supporting or opposing mass slaughter, leaving the Congresswoman to process the echo of her own divisive rhetoric. Remaining physically frozen while her fingers hovered hesitantly above her buzzing device, she endured the media executive reiterating exactly how she callously separated young adult citizens into horrifying ideological brackets upon a metropolitan walkway. Taking a sharp inhalation, he revealed that the spiritual leader situated directly behind him possessed a teenage daughter, pursuing medical studies at that precise university during the afternoon those explosive remarks were uttered. After highlighting that this young woman's grandfather miraculously survived an infamous European death camp as a mere child, he detailed how, mere days following the lawmaker's inflammatory public statements, digital vigilantes within a massive online chat group published a picture of the teenager's residential quarters, explicitly labeling her an acceptable casualty. Captured by an anonymous stalker prowling the academic corridors, the intimidating imagery forced the frightened undergraduate to completely abandon her campus housing and complete her foundational coursework remotely from her family's Midwestern residence. He explained that she officially transferred to a different religious academic institution, the very same college where her resilient ancestors sought his spiritual credentials following his liberation from the Holocaust, illustrating a horrifying generational continuity of persecution stretching from European concentration camps directly to a modern collegiate doorway simply because the politician carelessly hurled a deadly phrase into a cluster of reporters. Returning the floor to the committee head while burying his digital screen against the wood, he watched the representative finally acknowledge 3 rapid notifications on her own device before obscuring its display permanently for the remainder of the session. Assuming you believe an undergraduate scholar warrants safe housing utterly devoid of terroristic crosshairs, immediately distribute this broadcast to a family member or spiritual companion before returning to the stream, as the visiting Midwestern clergyman's impending testimony promises to emotionally shatter the entire assembly in entirely unforeseen ways. Transitioning to the spiritual leader's presentation, the presiding officer consulted his schedule and officially summoned the Minnesotan clergyman to the designated testifying position. The 51-year-old religious figure elevated himself from the gallery, dressed in dark formal wear accented by a miniature emblem representing ancient traditional garments, and navigated the brief distance to settle himself directly adjacent to the conservative media executive. Refusing to cast his gaze toward the embattled Congresswoman, he confidently affirmed his sacred oath to provide completely unvarnished honesty during the administrative swearing-in process. Maintaining perfectly steady extremities, he accepted the chairman's 2-minute allocation without ever retrieving the prepared document he had painstakingly concealed within his jacket the evening prior. Addressing the presiding officer and the assembled lawmakers, he formally introduced his identity and leadership role over his expansive Midwestern religious community. He proudly detailed his deep generational legacy within the clergy, outlining how both his grandfather and his father dedicated decades of their lives to leading prominent congregations in major Midwestern metropolitan areas. Recounting his father's horrific childhood origins in Eastern Europe, he explained how the boy was forcefully relocated to multiple notorious concentration facilities before reaching his 10th birthday. He solemnly noted that when Soviet infantry battalions finally breached the perimeter of the infamous extermination complex during the winter of 1945, his 11-year-old father emerged breathing while both his maternal parent and female sibling perished inside. After identifying his father as a solitary survivor and taking a quiet breath, he evenly described how perpetrators utilized common construction masonry to shatter his synagogue's decorative windows and vandalize their property with inflammatory slogans mere days following the catastrophic overseas terror attacks. He revealed that the threatening message affixed to their entrance directly mirrored the Congresswoman's infamous digital utterance, leading to the eventual apprehension and subsequent criminal convictions of 2 local individuals. Highlighting judicial evidence, he pointed out that one of the guilty vandals had actively circulated the exact same dismissive audio recording regarding the September 11th tragedies that the media executive had broadcast into the committee room mere minutes prior. Transitioning to his own offspring's collegiate nightmare, he heartbreakingly detailed how his teenage medical student was digitally hunted and her residence photographed by thousands of online radicals almost immediately following the representative's reckless pavement declarations, stating that she was forced to flee the Ivy League institution for a more secure religious academy. He expressed immense pride in her resilience, theorizing that her deceased Holocaust-surviving ancestors would view her endurance with unparalleled admiration. Letting a heavy stillness saturate the environment, he directly addressed the lawmaker, clarifying that he possessed absolutely no interest in extracting financial compensation, a verbal retraction, or her political abdication. His singular demand was that future federal legislators deeply consider the horrifying trajectory of their rhetoric when speaking before metropolitan press pools. He emphasized that inflammatory vocabulary acts as a virus, leaping from digital messaging boards directly onto vulnerable undergraduate doorframes and eventually manifesting as physical destruction within Midwestern religious parking facilities. Contrasting his father's unimaginable childhood trauma and subsequent lifelong recovery efforts, he warned that modern society simply cannot afford to ignore how easily political declarations can arm malicious individuals wielding heavy masonry. Concluding his powerful monologue and relinquishing the floor, he inadvertently sparked a desperate interjection from the defensive representative, which the presiding officer immediately suppressed with his wooden mallet. After the clergyman confirmed the completion of his statements, the committee leader officially dismissed him with profound appreciation, while the beleaguered Congresswoman entirely ignored the fresh notifications buzzing against her desktop. Provided you agree that university scholars shouldn't reside in marked crosshairs, instantly forward this broadcast to a trusted spiritual or familial companion without delay. Shifting the procedural momentum as liberal allies began breaking ranks, the committee had officially granted a brief window of speaking privileges to a specific Democratic legislator hailing from the Midwest. The 50-year-old African-American lawmaker rose from the gallery donning a dark-tailored outfit adorned with a patriotic emblem, clutching a weathered scriptural text gifted by an ancestral matriarch decades earlier. Fixing his gaze entirely upon the presiding officer rather than the warring factions, he expressed gratitude for the opportunity before proudly listing the specific urban and suburban municipalities encompassed within his Midwestern political territory. Highlighting his relatively recent inauguration into the federal legislative body, he confessed that enduring over an hour and a half of the agonizing proceedings, compelled him to vocalize his internal conscience before exiting the chamber. Taking a moment, he recounted his wildly expensive and ultimately victorious electoral battle against a deeply entrenched progressive incumbent, noting that international Middle Eastern relations served as the ultimate wedge issue for voters. He passionately argued that the blue-collar residents of his district propelled him to the nation's capital strictly because they rejected the false binary demanding they choose between domestic social justice advocacy and supporting a Jewish state. His electorate grew utterly exhausted by the toxic narrative dictating that minority communities couldn't defend Jewish undergraduates, especially after witnessing a local medical worker's child smeared as a massacre sympathizer simply for displaying a religious symbol on her book bag. Identifying himself as only the second African-American liberal to represent his state federally, he declared that his working-class family and neighbors conclusively determined that the boundaries separating international humanitarian empathy from the active persecution of domestic Jewish teenagers had dissolved entirely. Pivoting toward the embattled representative, he established his partisan loyalty by listing his consistent liberal voting record against conservative executive branch nominations and fiscal proposals to prove he was not acting as a political adversary. Nevertheless, he implored her to finally recognize the visiting clergyman and accept accountability for the irreversible fact that radical activists weaponized her specific rhetoric to justify terrifying an innocent student. Encountering only stubborn avoidance from his colleague, he regretfully surrendered his remaining time back to the leadership and returned to his seat. The presiding officer systematically moved down the docket to grant another 60-second speaking window to a prominent progressive lawmaker hailing from the Northeast. The 38-year-old official rose from the back gallery wearing a conservative blazer decorated with dual patriotic lapel emblems, having spent years utilizing vast digital networks to beg his political faction to establish moral boundaries regarding anti-Semitism. Expressing appreciation for the floor, he vigorously defended his progressive credentials by citing his steadfast opposition to the conservative administration's primary legislative and administrative maneuvers while representing an urban metropolis. He illustrated his incredibly humble origins growing up within subsidized municipal projects managed by a solitary Hispanic parent scraping together meager wages in an impoverished community, listing his marginalized intersectional identities spanning race, sexual orientation, religion, and extreme economic hardship. He highlighted that he perfectly embodied the exact demographic coalition the Minnesotan representative typically relied upon for political insulation. Waiting a beat, he firmly declared that he completely refused to offer her any solidarity during these proceedings. Turning directly toward her, he expressed his exhaustion over spending years publicly begging the far-left legislative coalition to definitively separate legitimate international political advocacy from the vile degradation of domestic Jewish citizens. Having demanded ethical clarity for over half a decade, he directly accused her of completely obliterating that boundary the previous spring by sorting Jewish youth into terrifying ideological buckets. He poignantly reminisced that within his tough urban neighborhood, Jewish children were viewed simply as integrated community members whose families actively contributed to the local society as educators and repairmen rather than being targeted as political combatants. He concluded by forcefully asserting that her horrific categorization methodology implemented on that metropolitan pavement functioned entirely as a behavioral permit for extremists before returning to his chair. The massive chamber fell incredibly quiet as reality set in that two highly influential minority figures from opposing regions of the nation utilized their national broadcast time to purposefully abandon their fellow progressive colleague. Assuming you have desperately desired to witness authentic moral bravery transcending partisan, racial, and regional divisions, immediately activate your digital alerts and join this channel because the consequences are only just initiating. Moving toward the final phases of the gathering, the presiding officer allocated a 3-minute concluding window to the conservative media executive. The media founder dramatically reduced his tempo while remaining firmly planted in his designated chair. Addressing the beleaguered representative directly, he apologized in advance for attempting the very psychological exercise the previous lawmaker had unsuccessfully begged her to perform. Inhaling deeply, he explicitly validated her brutal childhood history of East African displacement, parental loss, and freezing Midwestern poverty to prove he genuinely comprehended her underlying humanity. He recounted his own ancestral timeline of horrific European genocide and subsequent immigrant struggles within the very same urban neighborhoods previously mentioned, illustrating the profound religious traditions passed down through generations. Pointing out that his spouse's successful medical career in America was directly birthed from her family's frantic escape from Middle Eastern conflict zones, he forcefully reiterated their mutual legacy of displacement. Halting his momentum, he pleaded with her to understand that their shared survivor history requires absolute linguistic accuracy because public rhetoric inevitably escapes its original context to infect the broader society. He meticulously traced the destructive path of her vocabulary from shattered synagogue windows to terrorized collegiate housing, and finally to her vulgar dismissal of mourners mere hours following a prominent conservative organizer's tragic demise at a Western university. Emphasizing that language possesses terrifying momentum, he entirely abandoned his trademark rapid-fire delivery. Returning to ancient scriptural wisdom regarding avoiding spiritual judgment, he sincerely promised that he possessed absolutely no intention of evaluating the purity of her internal soul. Nevertheless, allowing a long silence to hang, he utilized his final seconds to directly connect her public statements to the physical vandalism and digital harassment trailing in their wake before finally relinquishing the floor. Ignoring a frantic sequence of physical notifications from her device, the embattled lawmaker rose in a desperate attempt to verbally battle the presiding officer, aggressively citing her unique demographic status before demanding her legislative minutes back. The committee had swiftly shut her down by declaring her political faction's allotted duration permanently exhausted, smoothly pivoting to inquire if the senior Democratic leadership harbored any objections to concluding the interrogation phase entirely. Gazing toward the veteran liberal figurehead who had remained mute throughout the proceedings, the chamber watched as the highly respected politician softly signaled complete surrender to the chairman's procedural authority without offering a single syllable of defense for his colleague. The isolated representative desperately scanned the room for an ally, only to find the veteran leadership ignoring her gaze, the progressive coalition director examining his own fingers, and even her most intimate political confidant staring blankly at the furniture. Following a final glance at her buzzing screen, she replaced the device upon the wood, ignored its subsequent tremors, and barely whispered her total capitulation into the broadcasting equipment. Striking his wooden block with extreme care, the presiding officer formally acknowledged the surrender, expressed gratitude to the testifying individuals, and mandated a half-hour intermission. Upon the legislative body's reconvening, the specific elevated chair previously occupied by the Minnesotan official was entirely vacant. She had vanished through a secondary exit unaccompanied, completely avoiding the press pool, refusing to publish any commentary, and never casting a final glance toward the chamber she abandoned. Her intermittently buzzing cellular equipment remained discarded on the desk until an assistant finally deactivated it hours later, ultimately delivering the sealed device to the lawmaker's private quarters, where Knox went entirely unheeded. Ultimately, even her most dedicated ideological leaders and closest personal allies completely refused to acknowledge her presence during her final moments of political relevance. Assuming you have spent decades hungering for authentic bipartisan consequences broadcast transparently across national networks, secure your channel alerts immediately because future proceedings promise to reveal even more staggering realities. Later that specific evening, as the Midwestern spiritual leader navigated his vehicle onto his congregation's property, the declining sunlight perfectly illuminated the recently funded replacement glass panes exactly as it had illuminated his father's original installations decades prior. Resting silently inside his automobile for a fleeting moment, he withheld his tears, having fully exhausted his emotional capacity for weeping during the tragic autumn several years earlier. Simultaneously traversing the Eastern Seaboard timeline, the undergraduate medical scholar firmly shut her complex scientific literature within the upper levels of her new religious academic facility in the bustling metropolis. Opting not to digitally respond to her parents' Midwestern message, she proceeded toward the Collegiate Religious Center, taking a seated position among dozens of peers behind the traditional gender partition to engage in twilight supplications. Deep within the urban housing projects of New York, the progressive representative arrived at his matriarch's dwelling to consume multiple portions of a traditional rice dish, completely avoiding discussion regarding the explosive legislative spectacle. Navigating toward a Midwestern athletic facility to retrieve his teenage athlete, the African-American lawmaker reviewed a specific digital scripture commanding humanity to act ethically, cherish compassion, and maintain spiritual modesty. Stowing the device before entering the gymnasium, the timeline simultaneously shifted to a southern state where the conservative executive crossed his residential threshold moments before dusk, prompting an inquiry regarding his exhaustion levels from his studying teenage offspring. Admitting mild fatigue as his spouse emerged near the beautifully concealed traditional braided bread gifted from a matriarch years prior, he embraced his partner right before the holy day commenced as she inquired in an ancient tongue about his success. Affirming the positive outcome of his grueling journey, he cleansed himself properly while his daughter ceremoniously ignited the sacred weekend flames. Merely days later, the Congresswoman's primary administrative director officially abdicated his position, circulating an early weekend bulletin that completely ignored the disastrous parliamentary event. By the subsequent week, premier financial journalists unleashed a devastating investigative piece revealing that the National Electoral Oversight attorneys had actively initiated a formal probe into her highly suspicious asset filings. During that same period, the head of the Progressive Legislative Coalition engaged in a lengthy national television interview where he actively dodged questions regarding the embattled member, refusing to directly identify a single participant from the controversial hearing. A fortnight later, the displaced medical student traveled back to her original Ivy League campus at the executive administrator's behest to address a forum on ideological security, delivering a brief speech while her father observed silently from the rear without ever announcing his presence. Roughly 30 days subsequently, an alliance of liberal and conservative lawmakers successfully navigated sweeping ethical transparency legislation through the committee, mandating instantaneous digital communication tracking for federal officials and granting massive investigatory powers to administrative oversight bodies. Over the ensuing quarter, the conservative executive's digital audio program surged to absolute dominance across major broadcasting platforms, following the release of the parliamentary recap, driving massive quarterly surges in premium corporate memberships. Half a year later, coinciding with a monumental historic anniversary, the undergraduate student authored a massive editorial piece in a prominent financial newspaper utilizing her actual identity, which her parents subsequently narrated during a major Midwestern religious festival. Following a massive influx of unprompted charitable contributions stemming directly from the national broadcast, the spiritual leader authorized the installation of 3 majestic Eastern decorative windows immortalizing his resilient father, his tragically deceased grandmother, and an ancient linguistic promise to preserve historical memory forever. Expressing deep gratitude for your extended attention, please guarantee you enthusiastically smash the approval icon before departing, ensuring this platform algorithmically distributes this phenomenal legislative confrontation to millions of exhausted working-class citizens desperate for justice. Secondly, navigate to the discussion section and type out the term representing ultimate responsibility, as this historic session finally provided a tangible demonstration of that elusive concept for the entire nation to witness. Finally, lock in your digital subscription and activate your alerts, as the upcoming week promises yet another explosive parliamentary confrontation exposing long-hidden realities surrounding influential elected officials. May Providence eternally shield the Midwestern spiritual leader and his resilient teenage offspring, who was cruelly forced to finalize her foundational collegiate studies from a childhood bedroom merely because a radicalized peer deemed her a valid casualty. May divine favor rest upon the memory of the resilient patriarch who miraculously survived an extermination camp as a child to pray fervently for decades, alongside the sacred memories of his mother and numerous relatives who were utterly consumed by the horrific European genocide. May the heavens reward the moral clarity of the African-American representative who boldly defied his political faction, as well as the progressive New York lawmaker who spent years demanding ideological boundaries and finally witnessed them enforced. May blessings pour over every marginalized citizen nationwide who patiently waited decades for a powerful politician to face brutal broadcasted scrutiny regarding their inflammatory rhetoric, culminating in a historic moment where the mallet dropped, the chamber cleared, the technology deactivated, and the agonizing consequences of public declarations finally manifested.